In this session, I am going to discuss literary terms starting with letter G and H. The first literary term is genre. It is a French term and that denotes types or classes of literature. The genres into which literary works have been grouped at different types are very numerous, and the criteria on which the classification have been based are highly variable. Since the writings of Plato and Aristotle, however, there has been an enduring division of the overall literary domain into three large classes in accordance with who speaks in the work: lyric, epic or narrative, and drama. A similar tripartite theme was elaborated by German critics in the late 18th and early 19th century, was cooked by James Joyce in his Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which was published in 1916, chapter 5, and functions still in critical discourse and in the general distinction in college catalogues between courses in poetry, prose fiction, and drama. Since 1950, an emphasis on generic type has been revised by some critical theorists. Also, or varied principle of classification, R.S. Crane and other Chicago critics have defended the utility for practical criticism of a refined distinction among genres based on Aristotle Poetics, in which works are classified in accordance with the similarity in the principle by which they are organized in order to achieve a particular kind of emotional effect. And other current theorists conceive genre as social formation on the model of social institution such as the state or church rather than on the model of biological species. And by structural critics, a genre is conceived as a set of constitutive convention and codes altering from age to age but shared by a kind of implicit contact between writer and reader. These codes make possible the writing of a particular literary text, though the writer may play against as well as with and the prevailing generic convention. In the reader, these conventions generate a set of expectation which may be converted rather than satisfy, but enable the reader to make the world intelligible. That is to naturalize it by relating to the world as defined and ordered by codes in the prevailing culture. The next literary term is Golden Age. The term derives from the form of chronological primitivism that was propounded in the Greek poet Hesiod's works and Days, which was published in 18th century, as well as by many later Greek and Roman writers. The earliest period of human history, regarded as state of perfect felicity, was called the Golden Age, and the continuous later decline of human well-being through time was expressed by the sequence the Silver Age and the Bronze Age, ending with the present sad condition of humanity, the Iron Age. The next literary term is Gothic novel. The word Gothic originally referred to the Goths, an early Germanic tribe, then came to signify Germanic and then medieval. Gothic architecture now denotes the medieval type of architecture, categorized by the user of the high pointed arch and vault, flying buttresses, and intricate recesses which spread through Western Europe between the 12th and 20th century. The Gothic novel, or its alternative term is Gothic romance, it is a type of prose fiction which was inaugurated by Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. It is a Gothic story which was published in 1764. The subtitle refers to its setting in the Middle Ages and flourished through the early 19th century. Some writers followed Walpole's example by setting their stories in the medieval period, and others set them in a Catholic country, especially Italy or Spain. The locale was often a gloomy castle furnished with dungeons, subterranean passages, and sliding panels. The typical story focused on the suffering imposed on an innocent heroine by a cruel and lustful villain and made bountiful use of ghosts, mysterious disappearances, and other sensational and supernatural occurrences. The principal aim of such novel was to evoke chilling terror by exploiting mystery and a variety of horror. The term Gothic has also been extended to a type of fiction which lacks the exotic setting of the earliest romances but develops a brooding atmosphere of gloom, terror, and represent events that are uncanny or melodramatically violent and often deals with aberrant psychological states. The next literary term is graveyard poets, a term applied to 18th century poets who wrote meditative poems, usually set in graveyard on the theme of human mortality, in moods which range from elegiac pensiveness to profound gloom. For example, Thomas Pennell's The Night Piece on Death, which was published in 1721, Edward Young's Long Night Thought, which was published in 1742, and Robert Blaird's The Grave, which was published in 1743. The next literary term is great chain of being. The conception of great chain of being is grounded in an idea about the nature of God or the first cause in the Greek philosopher Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus, and was developed by later thinkers into a philosophy to account for the origin, types, and relationship of all living things in the universe. This worldview was already prevalent in the Renaissance but was refined the greatly developed by the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz early in the 18th century and then adopted by a number of thinkers of the Enlightenment in its compressive 18th century form. The great chain of being was based on the idea that the essential excellence of God consists in his limitless creativity, that is, in an unstinting overflow of his own being into the fullest possible variety of other beings. And from this premise were issued three consequences. The first is plentitude. The universe is absolutely full of every possible kind and variety of life. No conceivable species of being remains unrealized. Second is continuity. Each species differs from the next by the least possible degree and so merges all but imperceptibility into the species most nearly related to it. The third is gradation. The existing species exhibit a hierarchy of status and so compose a great chain or ladder of being extended from the lowest condition of the merest existence up to God Himself. In this chain, human beings occupy the middle position between the animal kind and the angels or purely spiritual beings. And on this concept, Leibniz and other thinkers also grounded what is called the doctrine of philosophical optimism, means the view that this is the best of all possible worlds. The next literary term is haiku. It is sometimes spelled hokku. It is a Japanese poetic form that represent in 17 syllable ordered into three lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables. the poet's emotional or spiritual response to a natural object, scene, or season of the year, and the strict form which relies on the short uniform and unstressed syllable structure of the Japanese language. It is very difficult in English. Most poets who attempt to haiku loosen the rule for the number and pattern of the syllable. The haiku greatly influenced Ezra Pound and other imaginists who set out to reproduce both the brevity and the distinctness of the image in Japanese original. Ezra Pound in A Station of the Metro is a well known instance of the haiku in the loosened English form. The next literary term is Harlem Renaissance. It is a period of remarkable creativity in literature, music, dance, painting, and sculpture by African Americans from the end of the First World War in 1973 through the 1920s. As a result of the mass migration south and to urban north in order to escape the legal segregation of American South, and also in order to take advantage of the jobs open to African Americans at the beginning of the war. The population of the region of Harlem become almost exclusively black and the vital center of African American culture in America. Distinguished writers who were part of the movement, including the poets, and they started a Harlem Renaissance. The next literary term is heroic couplet, lines of iambic pentameter which rhyme in pairs A A, B B, C C, and so on. The adjective heroic was applied in the later 17th century because of the frequent use of such couplet in heroic poem and in heroic dramas. This verse form was introduced into English poetry by Geoffrey Chaucer and has been in constant use ever since. From the age of John Dryden, so that of Samuel Johnson, the heroic couplet was the predominant English measure for all the poetic kinds. Some poets, including Alexander Pope, used it almost to the exclusion of other meters. The next literary term is heroic drama. It was mainly specific to the Restoration period. Through instance, continued to be written in the early 18th century. As John Dryden defined it, an heroic play ought to be an imitation in little of an heroic poem, and constitutively, love and valor ought to be the subject of it. By heroic poem, he meant epic, and the plays attempted to emulate the epic by employing as protagonist a large scale warrior whose actions involved the fate of an empire, and by having all the characters speak in an elevated and elaborate style, usually cast in the epigrammatic form of the closed heroic couplet. A noble hero and heroine are typically represented in a situation in which their passionate love conflicts. If the conflict ends in disaster, the play is called an heroic tragedy. The next literary term is humanism. In the 16th century, the word humanist was coined to signify one who thought or worked in the studia humanist or humanities, that is, grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy, as aspects and activities of men such as mathematics, natural philosophy, and theology. At the time, these studies focused on classical and above all Latin culture, and they put great emphasis on learning to speak and write good Latin. Scholarly humanists recovered editing and expounded many ancient texts in Greek and Latin, and so contributed greatly to the source of materials and ideas in the European Renaissance. These humanists also wrote many works concerned with educational, moral, and political themes based largely on classical writers such as Aristotle, Plato, and above all, Cicero. In the 19th century, a new world humanism came to be applied to the view of human nature, the general values, and the educational ideas common to many Renaissance humanists as well as to a number of later writers in the same tradition. The next literary term is hymn. In current usage, it denotes a song that celebrates God or expresses religious feeling and is intended primarily to be sung as a part of religious service. The term derives from the Greek hymns, which originally signified songs of praise that were for the most part addressed to the gods, but in some instance to human heroes or to abstract concepts. The early Christian churches, following classical example, introduced the singing of hymns as a part of the liturgy. Some of these consisted of the text of paraphrases of Old Testament plays, but other was composed as songs of worship by churchly authors of the time. The next literary term is hyperbole and understatement. The figure of speech or trope called hyperbole. Uh, its Greek mean and its meaning is overshooting. It is a bold overstatement or the extravagant exaggeration of fact or possibility. It may be used either for serious or ironic or comic effect. And the understatement, it means meiosis. It means which deliberately represents something as very much less in magnitude or importance than it really is or is ordinarily considered to be. A special form of understatement is litotes. It's a Greek word. It means plain or simple. The next literary term is imagery. This term is one of the most common in criticism and one of the most variable in meaning. Its application range all the way from the mental pictures, which it is sometimes claimed are experienced by the reader of a poem, to the totality of the component which make up of a poem. For example, C. De Levy's statement of poetic image, which was published in 1948. The next literary term is Imagism. It was a poetic vogue that flourished in England and even more vigorously in America between the years 1912 and 1917. It was planned and exemplified by a group of English and American writers in London, partially under the influence of the poetic theory of T.E. Hume, as a revolt against what Ezra Pound called the rather blurry, messy, and sentimentalist memories poetry at the turn of the century. Pound, the official leader of the movement, was soon succeeded by Emile Lovey. After that, Pound sometimes referred to the movement slightly as Imagism. Other leading participants for a time were H.D. D.H. Lawrence, William Cals Williams, John Gould Fletcher, and Richard Aguilera. The Imagist proposal, as voiced by Amy Lowell in her preface to the first of three anthologies called Some Imaginist Poet, which was came between 1915 and 17, were for a poetry which, abandoning conventional poetic material and versification, is free to choose any subject and to create its own rhythm, use common speech, and present an image or vivid sensory description that is hard, clear, and concentrated. The typical Imaginist poem is written in free verse and undertake to the render as precisely and tersely as possible and without comment of generalization. The next literary term is imitation. In literary criticism, the word imitation has two frequent but diverse application. The first is to define the nature of literature and the other arts, and the second is to indicate the relation of one literary work to another literary work which served as its model. The next literary term is influence and the anxiety of influence. Critics and historians of literature have for many centuries dealt with what has been called the influence of one author or the literary tradition upon a later author who is said to adopt and at the same time to alter aspects of subject matter, form, or style of the earlier writer of writers among traditional topics of discussion. For example, Homer's Virgil, uh, of Virgil on Milton, of Milton on Wordsworth, or of Wordsworth on Wallace Stephen. And the anxiety of influence is a phrase used by the influential contemporary critic Harold Bloom to identify his radical revision of this standard theory that influence consists in a direct borrowing or assimilation of the materials and features found in earliest writers. The next literary term is intentional fallacy. It signifies what is claimed to be the error of interpreting and evaluating a literary work by reference to evidence outside the text itself. For the intention, the design, and purpose of its author, the term was proposed by V.K. Wimsett and Maurer C. Bursley in The Intentional Fallacy, which was published in 1946, and it is reprinted in Wimsett The Vertical Icon, which was published in 1964. They asserted that an author's intended aim and meaning in writing a literary work, whether they are asserted by the author or merely inferred from our knowledge of the author's life and opinions, are irrelevant to the literary critic because the meaning, structure, and the value of a text are inherent with the finished, freestanding, and public work of literature itself. The next literary term is interpretation and hermeneutics. In the narrow sense, to interpret a work of literature is to specify the meaning of its language, and by analyzing paraphrase and commentary, usually such interpretation focus on especially obscure, ambiguous, or figurative passage. In a broader sense, to interpret a work of literature is to make clear the artistic features and purport in the overall work of literature of which language serves as the medium. Interpretation in this sense include the analysis of such matter as the work genres, component, element, structure, theme, and effect. And the term hermeneutics originally designated the formulation of principle of interpretation that applies specifically to the Bible. The principles incorporated both the rules governing a valid reading of the biblical text and exegesis or commentary on the application of the meanings expressed in the text. Since the 19th century, however, hermeneutics has came to designate the theory of interpretation in general, that is, a formulation of the principle and method involved in getting at the meaning of all written text, including legal, historical, and literary as well as biblical text. And the next literary term is interpretation, typological and allegorical. The typological mode of interpreting the Bible was inaugurated by St. Paul and developed by the early church father as a way of reconciling the history of prophecy and the law of Hebrew scripture with the narrative and teaching of the Christian scriptures. As Saint Augustine expressed this principle in the Old Testament, the New Testament is concealed. In the New Testament, the Old Testament is revealed in typological theory, that is, the key person, action, and events in the Old Testament are viewed as a figure. It is a Latin word used for figures which are historically real themselves, but also prefigure those person, action, and events in the New Testament that are similar to them in some aspect, function, or relationship. Often the Old Testament figures are called types, and their later correlative in the New Testament are called antitypes. And the allegoric interpretation of the Bible had its root in Greek and Roman thinkers who treated classical myths as allegorical representation of abstract cosmological, philosophical, or moral truth. The method was applied to narrative in the Hebrew scriptures by the Jewish philosopher of 3rd century, and the fundamental distinction in the allegorical interpretation of the Bible is between the literal meaning of the text, the historical truth that is specifically signified, and the additional spiritual or mystical or allegoric meaning that it signified by analogy. The spiritual aspect of text literally meaning was often in turn subdivided into two more levels. The first is fourfold meaning, which means many biblical passages. A typical set of distinction was proposed by Saint Thomas Aquinas and others. The literal or historical meaning, which is a narrative or what in fact happened, and the allegorical meaning proper, which is the New Testament truth or else the prophetic reference to the Christian church that is signified a passage in the Old Testament, and the topological meaning signified by which is signified the moral truth or doctrine signified by the same passage, and the fourth is the anarchic meaning or reference of the passage to Christian astrology, that is the event that are came to in the last days of Christ's judgment and the life after death of individual soul. And they were employed in sermons and in a great variety of writing on religious method, and were adapted to iconography, that is representation of biblical and non-biblical person and events intended to have allegoric or symbolic significance in painting and sculpture. The next literary term is invective, is the denuation of a person by the use of derogatory epithet. The next literary term is irony. In Greek comedy, the character called the Irian was a dissembler who characteristically spoke in understatement and deliberately pretended to less intelligent than he was, yet triumphed over the alien, the self-deceiving and stupid predator. In most of the modern critical use of the term irony, there remains the root sense of dissembling or hiding what is actually the case, not however in order to deceive, but to achieve special theatrical or artistic effect. And most common type of irony is verbal irony, which was traditionally classified as one of the tropes, is a statement in which the meaning that a speaker implies differ sharply from the meaning that is obstinately expressed. And in it, another type of irony is unstable irony, which means it offers no fixed standpoint, which is not itself undercut by further ironies. The next term is sarcasm. In common parlance, is sometimes used as an equivalent for all forms of irony, but it is far more useful to restrict it only to the crude and taunting use of apparent praise for discourse. The term irony, qualified by an adjective, is used to identify various literary devices and modes of organization, and Socratic irony takes its name from the fact that as he is represented in Plato's dialogue, the philosopher Socrates usually dissembles by assuming a pose of ignorance, an eagerness to be instructed, and a modest readiness to entertain opinions proposed by others, although these, upon his continued questioning, always turn out to be ill grounded or to lead to absurd consequences. And dramatic irony involves a situation in a play or a narrative in which the audience or reader shares with the author knowledge of present or future circumstances of which a character is ignorant. And cosmic irony is attributed to literary works in which a deity or else fate is represented as through deliberately manipulating events so as to lead to protagonists to false hopes only to frustrate and mock them. And romantic irony is a term introduced by Friedrich Hegel and other German writers of the late 18th and early 19th century to designate a mode of dramatic or narrative writing in which the author builds up the illusion of representing reality only to shatter it by revealing that the author as artist is the creator and arbitrary manipulator of the characters and their actions. The next literary term is Ivory tower. It is a phrase taken from the biblical Song of Songs, in which it is said of the beloved woman, their neck is as a tower of ivory. In the 1830s, the French critic Saint Beauvoir applied the phrase tour de vivre to the stance of the poet Alfred de Vigny to signify his isolation from everyday life and his exaltation of art above all practical concerns. Since then, ivory tower has been frequently employed to signify an attitude or a way of life which is indifferent or hostile to practical affairs and the everyday world, and more specifically to signify a theory and practice of art which insulate it from moral, political, and social concern or effects. So that's all about today's session. If you like my video, please like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much.